This is a video on Bhagavad-Gita chapter 3. We saw in the chapter 2 how Krishna surveyed the progressive steps from tamas to rajas to sattva to transcendent. At each stage, Krishna asked Arjuna to fight, but for different reasons. First, Krishna gave the reason that if Arjuna doesn't fight, then he will incur infamy. People will consider him weak and impotent. Second, Krishna gave the reason that if Arjun fights, then he will enjoy the riches of the earth, and even if he dies, he will go to the heavenly planets. Third, Krishna gave the reason that if Arjun fights without motivation of gain or loss, then he will become free of the cycle of birth and death. Fourth, Krishna gave the reason that Arjun should fight simply because it is the intelligent thing to do, as it leads to the protection and expansion of truth, right, and good. And through this protection, Arjun will be of the nature of Ishvara and thus joined with him by doing what Ishvara intends and does in this world. We also saw how Arjun stays silent on the first three of these arguments, namely losses, gains, and liberation, but spoke when Krishna talked about uniting with Ishvara through intelligence. We will see later in Bhagavad Gita how Krishna advises Arjun to unite with Ishvara through love and devotion. However, that comes later when one has developed love and devotion for the person. So there is a subtle difference between knowing God rationally, intelligently, and logically versus knowing God personally, lovingly, and intimately. To the beginner, we always teach the nature of God rationally, intelligently, and logically. And once someone is convinced that God is indeed truth, right, and good, then gradually we teach them about God personally, lovingly, and intimately. If this rational, intelligent, and logical process is not undertaken in the preliminary stages through what Krishna calls Buddhi Yoga, then one mistakes thinking of God's love as mundane love, which, as we discussed earlier, is described by phrases such as falling in love rather than rising in love, love is blind rather than love is light, or madly in love rather than wisely in love. And so love and devotion come very late, even in the Bhagavad Gita. The initial step is to rise, see the light, and become wise. The love that comes after that is persistent, and without it, love is fleeting. And so, in the later chapters, Arjun will begin unpacking all that Krishna taught in the second chapter, beginning with Karma Yoga. In the later chapters, Arjun will ask about Jnana Yoga and Dhyana Yoga, and then Bhakti Yoga will come after that. Now, one of the crucial things we have to understand from the very beginning is that all these yoga paths are steps of a ladder. However, this ladder is not physical but semantic. In a physical ladder, the higher rung is completely separate from the lower rung. But in a semantic ladder, the higher rung includes the lower rungs. For example, shades like mustard, chrome, and lime are part of the class called yellow. Similarly, yellow is a part of the class called color. Likewise, color is itself a part of the class called vision. And so when we rise in the semantic ladder, such as going from chrome to yellow to color to vision, then the higher step includes the lower steps. But that doesn't happen while using a physical ladder. And so when we say that these yoga paths are rungs of a ladder, we are talking about a semantic ladder rather than a physical ladder. The ultimate goal is the same, namely to reach the top. And so someone can make a ladder in which they begin with Jnana Yoga, then go to Karma Yoga, then go to Dhyana Yoga, and then go to Bhakti Yoga. and others can make ladders with rearranged rungs. One can also imagine multiple ladders in which one climbs simultaneously or alternately, combining karma, jnana, dhyana, and bhakti. And so there is great freedom in each person making their personal ladders. To understand this freedom, we have to know the nature of the soul, which is called Satchidanand. The soul in the Vedic tradition is not a monolith, as in monotheistic religions. Rather, as we have discussed, there is a moral aspect, a rational aspect, and an emotional aspect. In an earlier video, we noted that these are similar to the ethos, logos, and pathos of Greek philosophy, although Greeks went to great length to relativize ethos and pathos and essentially precluded them from philosophy and science. Meanwhile, they reduced rationality to arithmetic and geometry, due to which religion eventually became a relativistic and subjective matter, while science became numbers, shapes, and mathematical equations. But morality, rationality, and emotionality are not relativized in the Vedic tradition. Rather, morality is doing the greatest good, rationality is knowing and teaching the complete nature of reality as meaning and purpose, and emotionality is loving the Ishvara, from whom this entire meaningful and purposeful reality springs forth and works according to moral, rational, and emotional nature of the Ishvara. As a part serves the whole. And so, due to the aspected nature of the soul, there are multiple ways to lift the soul, either by morality or by rationality or by emotionality or by some permutation and combination of these. For example, Karma Yoga is about lifting the soul by morality. Jnana Yoga is about lifting the soul by rationality. And Bhakti Yoga is about lifting the soul by emotionality. Since Ishvara is both immanent and transcendent, therefore Dhyana Yoga is about worshipping the Ishvara within oneself. And Bhakti Yoga is about worshipping the Ishvara in the form of an image of a deity. Ishvara can also be worshipped through art, music, poetry, dance, and song, and so on. Therefore, whatever people call culture also becomes a path for lifting the soul. In this way, there are many ways to lift the soul. The crucial thing about the semantic ladder is that the topmost rung includes everything below it. And so the lower rungs build the components of the topmost rung. This is why the Vedic tradition is never exclusivist or prescriptive about what a person must do to progress spiritually. It doesn't mean things are vague or unknown or left to everyone's imagination. It is merely an outcome of the fact that the topmost rung contains rationality, morality, and emotionality in all the diverse ways conceivable. And so, whatever lifts the soul is accepted as a valid path towards the higher rungs. And so, people who don't know why diversity exists and is useful for different people in different ways simply came up with claims such as Hinduism is just a way of life, as if Hinduism takes no one to transcendence beyond this life, as if Hinduism doesn't give us perfect knowledge of reality, as if Hinduism doesn't teach people about finding the Ishvara within, as if Hinduism doesn't talk about the myriad deities and their different methods of worship. So, those who make such claims are basically ignorant, and instead of educating themselves, they normalize the ignorance. But Krishna and Arjun don't normalize this ignorance. They discuss the progressive path from tamas to rajas to sattva to transcendent. They discuss different kinds of yoga paths and then discuss what is better or worse, which means how to ascend this ladder of yoga paths to progressively higher stages. And they discuss the symptoms of each stage so one can know whether one is progressing or not. Finally, all these things are integrated in the multifaceted nature of the soul. So, all this diversity of paths involves unity in the nature of the soul and integrates in the perfectional stage when one realizes one's own nature and the nature of Ishvara perfectly. And so, getting rid of ignorance is the first step, which is why Jnana Yoga is generally the first step to even take the next step. But of course, Arjun has crossed that first step of ignorance in the second chapter and understood that there is a ladder of progress. So now he begins asking about the different rungs. Whenever we talk about an aspected reality, we must know that each aspect underdetermines the other aspects. We can illustrate this principle by the example of the elephant and the five blind men story. Each blind man touches either the tail or the trunk or the stomach or the ears or the legs. And when blind men talk to each other, they argue about what the elephant really is. But the visionary man sees all the aspects and reconciles them. So none of the blind men are completely wrong, nor are they completely correct. And so we cannot apply binary logic to the blind men because they are partially correct and partially wrong. Similarly, each of the parts of the elephant underdetermines the other parts. For example, a tiger or a lion don't have a trunk, but some antelopes, anteaters, and seals have trunks. But each of their trunks have a shape slightly different than the trunk of the elephant. Of course, different elephants may have longer or shorter, thicker or thinner trunks. And so by the trunk, we can know that the animal is not a lion, tiger, dog, or a cat. But it is harder to decide if that animal is an antelope, anteater, seal, or elephant. And so, in general, the trunk tells us what the animal is not, but doesn't tell us what the animal is. It is, for example, very hard to know if the elephant is male or female, adult or child, simply by the trunk. And so the trunk underdetermines the whole animal. Again, we cannot apply binary logic because the trunk neither fully determines the animal nor leaves the animal fully undetermined. We can extend this example to the soul as well. The soul is multi-aspected, so each aspect underdetermines the other aspect. And yet, all the aspects must be present. We don't get an elephant if some body parts are missing, or if an animal has the trunk of an elephant but the legs of a horse. So multi-aspects always create a confusion if we are blind men and don't see the whole elephant. The same kind of confusion arises regarding the yoga paths. One might ask, are you talking about emotionality or rationality or morality? Are you talking about the pursuit of knowledge or the performance of duty or the focus on meditation or the worship of a deity or the chanting of mantras or the performance of rituals? Arjun begins with this kind of question. He asks, you just talked about Buddhi Yoga and now you are asking me to fight. If knowledge is the key aim of life, then why should I fight this ghastly war? Your statements have left me confused. Arjuna expects that Krishna will tell him about one path or the other, because how can contradictory pursuits like knowledge and war be reconciled, let alone lead a person to the same destination? In response to Arjun's question about whether he should pursue knowledge or war, Krishna says that one cannot achieve perfection neither by renunciation of action nor by the renunciation of knowledge, and so both are essential. The idea that either one of those is required, as Arjun assumes in his question, is false. Both are necessary and mutually complementary. Of course, we can only do one thing at a time, not everything at once. And so Krishna uses the word siddhim or perfection. Yes, we can do one thing at a time, but we will not attain perfection by one. In this regard, Vedic texts draw a distinction between jnana and vijnana. Jnana is theoretical knowledge. Theoretically, we all know that one day we will die. Theoretically, many people may accept that we will be reborn. But that theoretical knowing doesn't mean we change our life to live according to that knowledge. For example, if we know that we will one day die, then putting it into practice means that we don't spend our whole life accumulating wealth. We need enough wealth for sustenance, which we can call financial freedom. Once we have financial freedom, we need to spend time on spiritual pursuits. But very few people do that. Instead, they spend their life earning money way beyond their needs, not realizing that one day all this will amount to nothing. Similarly, if we know that we will be reborn, then we must not earn money through sinful means, such as through deceit, theft, and violence, because that will bring immense suffering in future lives. And yet, many people who may accept that they will be reborn continue accumulating money beyond their sustenance through deceit, theft, and violence, not realizing the immense suffering they are creating for themselves. And so, neither knowledge nor action are sufficient by themselves. If we don't know about rebirth, then our actions will likely be sinful. But even if we know about rebirth but don't work to make our future life better, then that knowledge is worthless. And so both knowledge and action are necessary, and yet neither is sufficient by itself. This is again a general pattern we will see across multifaceted realities. Each facet is necessary, and none of them are individually sufficient. However, all of them are collectively sufficient. And so we have to know about rebirth and then act according to that knowledge. If we don't know, we will be sinful, and if we don't act accordingly, then we haven't truly accepted the knowledge. And so this theoretical knowledge is called jnana, and acting according to that knowledge is called vijnana. One with jnana can preach but cannot practice, and his words have no conviction. But one with vijnana can preach and practice, and his words have conviction. And so, for example, if Arjun knows that he will be reborn, then he must know that the future life will be better or worse based on whether he has done his moral duty in this life. Simply knowing that he will be reborn is insufficient if he doesn't put that knowledge into practice by doing his duties. In earlier videos, we talked about good karma, bad karma, and no karma. These are also called sukarma, vikarma, and akarma. Now, many people misinterpret akarma as inaction, although it means actions that don't produce good or bad consequences. In general, every action is like a seed which will fructify into good or bad outcomes in the future. But akarma is like a roasted or fried seed which will not produce any action. When there is no outcome of our actions, then we are freed from the cycle of birth and death because we don't have to take birth to reap the results of our previous actions. And so akarma means actions that lead to liberation. The essence of akarma is that we don't neglect our duties and we don't do our duties expecting results. Because if we neglect our duties, then vikarma or bad karma is generated. And if we do our duties desiring results, then sukarma or good karma is generated, both of which bind us to the cycle of birth and death. But if we do our duties diligently, then no bad karma is generated. And if we do these duties without desiring results, then no good karma is generated. And so akarma is freedom. And yet, many people misunderstand akarma as inaction. This is because karma has two meanings. One, it means the action, and two, it means the results of actions. Factually, the result of action is another action, which we generally call reaction. Since a reaction is also an action, therefore karma is used for both action and reaction. And so some people might interpret karma as the absence of action rather than the absence of reaction. And this creates the confusion that when we advocate akarma as absence of reaction, we are advocating the absence of action. And so, to get the correct interpretation, we have to combine the previous chapter verse where Krishna says, by inaction you will incur sins, to conclude that we are advocating for absence of reaction. Krishna further advises Arjun that we cannot live without action even for a moment. As he says, Nahi kaschit shanam api jatu tishtati akarmakrit, which means we cannot stay inactive even for a moment. Now, someone might ask, well, I can sit idle and do nothing, so how can you say I can't be idle? And the answer is that action and inaction pertain to the soul and not the body. As we have discussed a few times, the body is not moving and only the soul is moving. And so, real inaction is when the soul is idle. But factually, the soul is never idle except during sleeping, because every moment it makes a choice. The choice may be to do nothing, but that is still a choice, and so an activity. Every moment we sit idle and do nothing, we are making a choice, so we are continuously active even as the body seems inactive. Krishna further clarifies that we are forced to constantly be active because of Prakriti Jair Gunar, which means the qualities of Prakriti. These qualities are never static. Rather, every moment some quality goes unmanifest or hidden, and another quality goes manifest or revealed. Due to this constant movement of Prakriti, no two moments in time are identical, and every moment in time is unique. So, due to these unique movements in time, something different is always happening in our intellect, mind, senses, and body. Like a passenger in a continuously moving chariot sees new sights at every moment. Even if the soul simply watches these sights one by one, the choice of watching is a choice and activity. So it cannot be called inactivity. And so every moment of waking and dreaming is activity. Only during deep sleep this activity stops. This is why Buddhists talk about going to deep sleep. But as long as we are awake or dreaming, we are choosing, and we cannot become free of the cycle of birth and death unless we make the choice of doing our duty selflessly. Even Buddhists cannot get free of repeated birth and death simply by renouncing the world. They have to do some duty, such as teaching others about enlightenment. If they don't teach but they take food from others, then they are involved in sinful activity. We can give more than we take without getting karma, but we cannot take more than we give without getting karma. And so, we should always aspire to give more value than we take. Finally, Krishna says that those who simply restrain their bodies while their minds are actively thinking, feeling, and willing are false actors or pretenders. They cannot keep pretending forever. Someday they will lose control over their mind and act adversely. And so, this silent meditation, neglectful of duty, is not a stable, let alone permanent state. The Vedic texts tell so many stories of great sages who tried to control their senses and mind, but as they gain the mastery, nature sends some distraction which breaks their meditation and a person falls from their advanced state. A permanent meditation is possible only if the object of meditation is millions of times more attractive compared to everything else. Krishna is such an object of meditation. He is so much more attractive that if someone perfects that meditation, nothing else is remotely as attractive. And so that meditation never breaks. But that is a topic we will come to later in the Bhagavad-Gita. Right now, we just ought to know that as long as we are awake or dreaming, we are active. And choosing to not do our duty is also a choice and activity, which creates vikarma or adverse reactions. After making a couple of negative statements, such as nobody can stay idle even for a moment, and nobody can attain perfection by neglecting either duty or knowledge, Krishna makes the positive statement, which is as follows: Yagnarthat karmano annitra lokoyam karma bandhana. It means if your work is a yagna, then you are not bound by karma bandhana or results of your actions. Some people say work is worship. It is true if our work is like a yagna or ritual sacrifice made for the pleasure of Lord Vishnu. Work for Vishnu is not simply detachment from desire for results, and working for the pleasure of Vishnu is not mundane desires, because Vishnu is the ultimate meaning and purpose of everything. As we have discussed from the beginning, the universe is expanded from Vishnu for his pleasure. So if we offer all the expansions, including ourselves, in the service of Vishnu, then the original purpose of expansion is fulfilled. Good or bad karma is created only by purposes deviated from the original purpose. However, if we fulfill the original purpose, then there is simply pleasure without any reaction. So this is action without reaction. In the last few centuries, impersonalists created the slogan that work is worship. But as Krishna noted earlier, the soul is never inactive, even if the body seems inactive. So even if the body is lying awake on the bed, the soul is working. And so by the impersonalist stance, staying idle is also worship. Similarly, even a criminal works, so his criminality must also be worship. In this way, nobody can be said to not be worshipping, including criminals and lazy people, which begs the question why we even need a slogan such as work is worship. To even make that slogan, we have to explain what we mean by work and how that work frees us from vikarma and sukarma, or the cycle of birth and death. Impersonalists don't have any answer to that because they don't have an explanation of how the world was created for the pleasure of Vishnu and how karma is created only when we deviate from the purpose for which Vishnu created the world. Their slogan of work is worship doesn't lead to liberation because work includes immoral activity and inaction rather than dutiful action. Therefore, Prabhupada translates Yagnarthat as work done for the pleasure of Vishnu. The word yagya means a ritual offering, and artha means meaning and purpose. The ultimate meaning and purpose of all ritual offerings is Vishnu, which is why in all yajna, Vishnu is made the first and the last offering. The first offering signifies that Vishnu is the most important deity, and the last offering signifies that he is the ultimate goal of worship. So, work for Vishnu is worship, and all other work is not. This definition of work eliminates both laziness and criminality, and it accepts only duties. Moreover, this duty is not done without thinking of any result, but with the aim of pleasing Vishnu. And this work for the pleasure of Vishnu reconciles the conflict that Arjuna was having between Buddhi Yoga and Karma Yoga. As we discussed in the last video, Buddhi Yoga pertains to the ultimate truth, right, and good, personified in Ishvara. And Karma Yoga pertains to working without worrying about personal gain and loss. So when we work for Vishnu, then we are working for the ultimate truth, right, and good, and not working for personal gain and loss. And so there is positive attachment due to Buddhi Yoga, along with the negative detachment due to Karma Yoga. Now, detachment and attachment become two sides of a coin. And even though Arjun initially thought that they are mutually contradictory, Krishna tells him that it is not actually so. In the video on chapter 1, we discussed the Vedic ideas of socialism and capitalism. We described how socialism is benefiting the ordinary people on the earth through charity, and capitalism is worshipping the demigods to receive natural wealth. We discussed how the demigods, when worshipped, provide all the necessities of life, although the cost of doing these rituals is far less than the benefits. This is capitalism because the benefits are greater than the costs. And then, when the benefits are passed to the entire society through charity, then the process also becomes socialism. We talked about how kings collected taxes to perform big rituals, and then the people who gave money through taxes received natural wealth, much of which they gave away in charity. The good karma accumulated by charity and rituals then ensured a better future life for those who did it. And so people did not need to work very hard for economic development. They just collected taxes from the wealthy and then did rituals, and then they got a lot in return, which they distributed, ensuring not just prosperity across the society, but also their own prosperity across their lifetimes. To understand this cost benefit difference of rituals, we can think in terms of parents and children. The parents provide the children with food, shelter, clothing, and security. But in return, the children do small activities for parents, such as making a birthday card for them, hugging them, or showing gratitude by helping them in doing simple and easy household chores. Factually, children can do all of these things playfully, and yet, out of affection for children, the parents feel that the children have done a lot for them. For loving parents, a small thing done by the children feels like a big thing, and for the loving children, the small things feel like child play. The parents feel energized if they see that their children are moral and dutiful, because the greatest joy for a parent is seeing that their children are growing up into happy, healthy, moral, and responsible adults. Now the parents voluntarily reward the good children even more. Similarly, Krishna says later in the Bhagavad-Gita that one who offers a flower, a fruit, a leaf, or some water to him with devotion, then he accepts it. So Krishna is the master of all the universes, and yet he is pleased simply by offering him fruit, flower, leaf, and water. For Krishna, this small offering feels like a big thing, and yet for the devotees, these small offerings to the Lord feel just like child play. The powerful demigods and the Lord already have everything they want, and they don't need anything from humans. But just like parents look for gratitude and affection from their children, demigods and the Supreme Lord also look for gratitude and affection in return. And if that gratitude and respect is shown, then the Lord and the demigods reward humans in return. But if the children are entitled, ungrateful, and demanding, they keep asking for more and more from their parents, and they don't respect and value whatever they receive graciously from their parents. Such kinds of children are burden on the parents. Even parents don't want to give these badly behaved children anything more than the bare minimum they need for survival. So, this parental psychology applies to the demigods and the Lord as well. If we are grateful, sacrificing, and frugal, then the demigods and the Lord want to give us more and more. But if we are entitled, ungrateful, and disrespectful, then the demigods and the Lord don't want to give us anything. If we disrespect or don't value what we receive graciously from the Lord and the demigods, then they also don't want to give us anything graciously with ease. Now the disrespectful and entitled children are forced to work a lot for getting little, and then life becomes very hard. These days, people wonder how India could be so prosperous without industrialization, electricity, and machines. How could wealthy cities exist? How could massive temples be built? And how could people wear so much jewelry? That is because they have no idea about real capitalism, in which the demigods supply to humans if the humans simply show a little gratitude. Instead, most people think that nature works according to some mathematical laws, which must also work the same in the past, present, and future. So, those who worship demigods through rituals were primitive and unscientific people who did not know how nature actually works and simply anthropomorphized nature's working as the work of gods. This shift in attitudes comes from monotheistic religions, which destroyed demigod rituals as polytheism. And after that, whatever prosperity they had until then died. But instead of tracing their poverty back to the lack of rituals, they decided to steal wealth from those who did such rituals, as they still had abundant wealth. And so, since the dawn of monotheism, the idea of capitalism is to steal wealth from whoever has it. Of course, to steal, one needs an army of warriors, which also have to be suitably compensated. And so, the monotheistic warlords would lead a war for theft and then distribute part of the stolen wealth among their warriors. And so, distributing some wealth among the warriors who help in stealing is the monotheistic idea of socialism. Both socialism and capitalism depend on theft, but they call it God given mercy, grace, and compassion without realizing that if God had indeed favored them, then they would not have to steal. Of course, they don't teach what modern socialism and capitalism really are in school and college, because that would expose the fact that the whole thing rests on theft. For example, many so called first world countries at present simply print money and buy valuable goods in exchange for printed paper. And then they force the sellers to reinvest that printed paper back into their government bonds, based on which their government doles out social benefits. Giving printed paper in exchange for valuable goods is called capitalism, and redistributing the paper reinvested in government bonds among the citizens is called socialism. But they don't teach what socialism and capitalism really are in schools and colleges because the whole thing depends on theft. The textbooks on economy talk about free markets, international trade, the rule of law, and so on. But none of that is actually reality. The reality is stealing and redistributing the theft. And so, in these verses, Krishna describes that those who enjoy the gifts of the demigods without offering them to the demigods are certainly thieves. We don't have to simply believe this claim. We can see a long history of stealing in all religions that abrogated the demigods and manufactured fictitious gods and scriptures to justify their stealings as the commands of manufactured gods. However, Krishna says that the universe was created for humans and demigods living in mutually affectionate relationship. He says that simply by cooperation between humans and demigods, prosperity reigns for all, as all the necessities of life are supplied by the demigods. Then there is no scarcity, no struggle for existence, and everyone can live in peace and prosperity. And so, when the real deities are discarded and fictitious deities and scriptures are manufactured, the result is poverty. And to escape this poverty, people who manufactured scriptures and religions attack societies peacefully enjoying their God given wealth. The real motive is stealing, but they dress it up as spreading democracy, civilizing the barbarians, and modernizing the primitive. These religions have a poverty stricken mindset, and many of them think that there is a shortfall of resources on earth, and so population must be controlled. For otherwise, people will simply kill each other for survival. They forecast an end of the world through an apocalypse because when they began, their lives were so miserable and pathetic that they hoped that this nightmare will end soon. Apocalyptic theology is a dead giveaway about how miserable people following monotheisms have been, that they keep hoping, praying, and forecasting a quick end of the world. No naturally prosperous society thinks in this way. Naturally prosperous societies do charity because they know that the demigods will give them natural wealth, and whatever they give in charity will come back to them in future. And thus generosity comes naturally to those who understand that natural wealth comes from demigods, and meanness comes naturally to those who don't worship demigods and think that if they give away their wealth, then it will be lost forever. And so monotheistic societies destroy both natural socialism and capitalism. Natural capitalism is destroyed when demigod worship ends, and natural socialism is destroyed when a poverty stricken mind rejects charity after stealing wealth because he is afraid that he will not get wealth in the future. In earlier videos, we have talked about how a moral society is collectivist and how an immoral society is individualist. Krishna affirms this difference when he describes the universe as a chakra or wheel of sacrifices, in which everyone sacrifices for others, and what we sacrifice for others is returned back to us through the chakra or wheel. So one might ask, what is sacrifice? And Krishna answers by defining yajna as prescribed duties. Doing our duty is a sacrifice. It is not only pouring ghee or grain into fire, although that is also a sacrifice. But sacrifice goes beyond that, and it is done by each individual every moment in their life when they perform their duties. Of course, sometimes people expect a material result for their sacrifices, which, as we have discussed, is the attitude of a Rajasic person. But beyond that are Sattvic persons who sacrifice through duties without expecting a result. Whether one does sacrifices while expecting results or without such expectation, sacrifices and duties are done by both Rajasic and Sattvic people, so they create a moral society. Meanwhile, the individualist does no duty or sacrifice, but depends on others doing their duties and sacrifices. We discussed in the last video that this entitlement of receiving without giving is called the Bill of Rights. And it is the ideology of tamasic people who want to get everything without giving anything in return. And so, in the Vedic tradition, both Rajasic and Sattvic people are accepted as moral people. Later in the Bhagavad-Gita, we will see that Krishna calls them Sukriti, or those who do good deeds through duty and sacrifice. And Krishna says that these moral people eventually surrender to him. However, the immoral people who reject duties and sacrifices and simply demand that all their wishes be fulfilled as their rights are called Duskriti, and they never surrender to Krishna. And so, any society that works on the principle of rights degrades into immorality and sinfulness and never comes to Krishna until it gives up its entitled mindset. All these societies are tamasic and outside the bare minimum level expected for a moral society. A moral society begins with Rajasic and Sattvic attitudes, which means either doing duty and sacrifice expecting some reciprocation, or even better, just doing duty and sacrifice without expecting any reciprocation. The cycle of duties and sacrifices, also called the wheel of dharma or dharma chakra, is the central organizing principle of the universe in all religions that originated in India. Even godless religions like Buddhism and Jainism accept the wheel of dharma or dharma chakra, which means that the Vedic tradition lives in peaceful coexistence with them, which historically made India a tolerant and secular society. Because even if Buddhism and Jainism rejected Vedic texts and deities, they did not reject the wheel of dharma. All the problems come from religions and people who reject the cycle of duty and sacrifice and believe that they are uniquely and exclusively entitled by God to take from others through theft and violence while giving back nothing or far less. Factually, all those religions and people who reject the cycle of duty and sacrifice cannot even live with themselves because they are always focused on taking rather than giving. This is why we see so many wars between sects of religions who believe in the same God, the same prophet or Messiah, and the same scripture. That is the result of rejecting the wheel of dharma. And so Krishna talks about the cosmic wheel of dharma to Arjuna. He says that the food you are getting is due to rains, and the rains are produced from yajna, which is born of prescribed duties. For example, farmers produce grains and milk, and craftsmen manufacture goods, and they give these things to the warriors and rulers as taxes, who then give these away in charity to priests and teachers who perform sacrifices for the demigods and the Lord, which then produces rains, which then perpetuates the cycle of life through the cycle of duties and sacrifices. But if warriors and kings stop doing their duties and protecting the teachers and priests, then rains will reduce. The farmers will produce far less food and milk. The workers will not be able to manufacture as many goods. The warriors and kings will receive far less taxes. Then the teachers and priests will receive far less charity. And gradually this cycle of duties and sacrifices will come to an end. Now we can revisit the previous verses in which Krishna talks about stealing to the present verses about the cycle of sacrifices. If the cycle of sacrifices ends, then poverty ensues, and then one has to survive on stealing. This is actually proven through world history. All so-called pagan societies were living peaceful and prosperous lives on their own because they did rituals and sacrifices for the demigods. Then someone invented monotheism and destroyed the pagan religions. Some monotheistic religions started animal killing and offering blood and flesh to demigods, which moral people, including Rajasic and Sattvic demigods, never accept. So the destruction of pagan rituals brought poverty. And yet, to maintain their power, control, and kingdom, monotheistic religions manufactured elaborate theologies about a war between good and evil, the apocalyptic end of the miserable world, and so on, simply to steal from other people and societies. This is what Krishna describes as a life full of sin. Even though living for the satisfaction of the senses, their whole life is lived in vain. Because instead of rising from a human life to a higher form of life, or even continuing in human life in the next birth, such a person enters either animal or hellish life. Human life is very rare and precious because it offers a chance to rise to a better life. That is possible if we follow the wheel of dharma or the cycle of sacrifices. But if someone loses this rare and precious chance for elevation, he again enters an animal or hellish life where he suffers for a long time to come. Krishna calls these humans to be living in vain. Of course, there is no permanent hell or animal life, so they can correct themselves in the future, but this life is lost in vain. In the Vedic text, the material world is called a realm of duality, which means that for every gain there is some loss. As the saying goes, you can't eat your cake and have it too. Eating the cake may be a gain, but it is accompanied by a loss, namely, that after eating, we don't have the possibility of eating the same cake again. Similarly, the spiritual world is called in the Vedic text a realm of non duality, which means that there is no loss with any gain. For example, in the spiritual realm, if we eat a cake, the same cake can be eaten again. Thus, it is sometimes said that when we offer food to a deity, the deity sees the food, but his seeing is as good as eating. By seeing the cake is not destroyed, and yet the cake is enjoyed. Of course, a material body cannot live simply by seeing the cake because there is hunger. But there is no hunger in the spiritual body. We can understand this difference by the distinction between needs and wants. Hunger is a need and tasting is a want. In the material world, when needs are fulfilled, then losses accompany gains. But in the spiritual world, when wants are fulfilled, no losses accompany gains. That is because in the spiritual realm, there are no needs, although there are wants. For example, the Lord doesn't need to eat any food, and yet he wants to eat food made by his devotees. We can also say that the Lord is not hungry for food, but he enjoys tasting the food prepared by his devotees. A spiritually advanced person becomes just like the Lord, namely, he has no needs, and yet he wants. And so, in the material realm, when there are needs and every gain comes with some loss, a rational person fulfills his needs after evaluating gains and losses. Gains are the reason we do something, and losses are the reason we don't do something. For instance, we eat because we can do something useful with the body, and the gains of eating are greater than the losses of eating. But if we overeat or undereat, then we can't work, and then the gains of eating or not eating are less than the losses of eating or not eating, and we don't overeat or undereat. This calculation of gain and loss is independent of the wants to eat. For example, some people may not be hungry and yet they want to eat because wanting is in the tongue and hunger is in the stomach. So the tongue wants to eat even if the stomach doesn't need to eat. And so, to fulfill the desires of the tongue, someone may overeat. But suppose our stomach never developed hunger, then we will never need to eat. And yet, if someone offered us food with affection, we would taste that food to make the person offering us happy. Like that, the Lord accepts if we give something to Him with devotion and love. And so, Krishna says that a self realized person has no reason to do his duties, and yet he has no reason to not do his duties. By reason to do something, Krishna means gains, and by reason to not do something, Krishna means losses. So, ordinary people calculate gains and losses, but the self realized person doesn't do so. And yet, he does his duties not because of personal gain or loss, but because a greater good is served by such duties. Even the Lord doesn't need to work, and yet he works because it serves the greater good. Then Krishna cites the example of King Janak, who worked simply for the greater good, and by doing such work, he taught others by his own example of how to act in this world, namely, not for personal gain or loss, but for greater good. It also means that a self realized person would not do anything that leads to collective loss. And so, self realization doesn't mean a person simply sleeps or sits idle. He has no personal need to do anything, but he still wants the greater good. And that wanting is still a desire, but it is not a material desire because it is unselfish, compassionate, greater good, and the spiritual nature. This is a clear refutation of the impersonalist idea that in the self realized state there are no desires. Instead, the spiritual position is that there are no dualistic desires, which means my fulfillment against someone else's deprivation. When we act for the greatest good, then there is a desire, namely for the greatest good. And yet, that is not a selfish desire of me versus you, which is duality. So, desire for the greatest good is a desire, and yet it is a non dualistic desire. Similarly, Ishvara desires the greatest good, so his desires are not dualistic, involving me versus you. The Ishvara always acts for the greatest good, and hence his actions are non dualistic. Similarly, by acting for the greatest good, one attains the same attitude as the Lord himself. And so Krishna advises Arjun against action and inaction for personal gain and recommends Arjun to fight because it is a war for the greater good. This is to counter Arjun's desire to not fight, thinking about personal loss of family, or even to fight while thinking that he will enjoy the kingdom if he wins, or that he will go to heavenly planets if he dies. Thinking about personal gain or loss is Rajoguna, but doing one's duty without such calculation is Sattva-guna. Finally, working while thinking about the greatest good is transcendent. And so Krishna says two distinct things one after another. First, that a self-realized person has no personal reasons of gain or loss. Second, that a self-realized person still acts out of a sense of duty, and by such action he attains the highest state of perfection. That is because even if there is no personal consideration of gain and loss, there is still a consideration of the greatest good. Renouncing the former is sattva-guna, and embracing the second is transcendent. Working for the greatest good is the ideal work, and Krishna further explains this as the behavior of ideal people. He says that ordinary or common people simply follow what great people or people in a higher status of life do. Because an implicit assumption in everyone is that a person in a higher status of life is an ideal person. People look up to those in higher status of life and emulate their actions. If these individuals work for the greatest good, then ordinary people will follow their example and also work for the greatest good. And then everyone will be acting perfectly. Krishna gives his personal example and says that he has no personal need and therefore he has no reason to act based on personal need. And yet he acts for the greatest good because by him doing so, everyone who follows him also does the same. And then they will come to the perfectional stage of acting for the greatest good. If instead he acted selfishly or did not act altruistically for the greatest good, then others will follow his example and they will either act selfishly or not act altruistically for the greatest good, and that will bring ruination to the whole world. And so, with this personal example, Krishna merges the definitions of leadership, dharma, and transcendence. What is leadership? The answer is acting for the greatest good. What is dharma? The answer is acting for the greatest good. What is transcendence? The answer is acting for the greatest good. Conversely, what is waywardness? The answer is acting selfishly. What is against dharma? The answer is acting selfishly. What is the material condition? The answer is acting selfishly. And so there aren't many considerations of dharma, leadership, and transcendence. There is just one consideration, namely the greatest good. By acting for the greatest good, one becomes a leader, a dharmic, and a transcendentalist. Easy to remember and understand, although not easy to follow. All leaders of family, institutions, nations, countries, and the world must therefore act with the consideration of greatest good. If they can do that, then they are leaders. But if they don't, then they are not worthy of being leaders. People who act in their selfish interest, thinking about personal gain and loss, are factually not leaders. But if they ascend to the position of leadership, they bring ruination to a society. As we discussed in the first video in this series, the central problem of material life is individualism, which means each person for themselves. These days, those who ascend to leadership positions are mostly individualists. They are motivated by personal gain and loss and not the greatest good, and they bring ruination to their society. All individualistic societies suffer from corruption, immorality, and crimes at the highest level of leadership because leaders act in their self interest and not the collective interest. If we universalize individualism, as some societies have done, then all societies will have selfish, corrupt, immoral, and criminal leaders. By following them, everyone will be selfish, corrupt, immoral, and criminal, and that is the end of society. And so we can easily forecast the future of individualism, namely, that it ends in self-destruction. Conversely, we can easily forecast the future of collectivism, namely that it ends in self-strengthening. By these ordinary examples, we can see how Krishna's statements don't have to be accepted simply on faith and belief. We can prove that they are true by seeing their applications in our lives. At this juncture, someone might say that many societies have historically been collectivist, but they were overtaken by individualist societies. That is also the issue in Bhagavad-Gita being discussed, that Arjuna is thinking about compassion and collective good, while Duryodhana is not. And if Arjuna stood by his viewpoint, then he would simply walk away from the Mahabharat war and let the Kauravas win. Similarly, most global South countries today were historically collectivist and rooted in the concept of the world as an integrated whole. Although, as time passed, that world narrowed into a country, village, community, and eventually family. Sacrificing for the greater good has historically been a key ingredient of collectivist societies. But all these collectivist nations were colonized by the individualistic European nations. And so, someone can argue that this talk about collectivism leads to many problems when they come in contact with individualism. This argument looks superficially true, but it is wrong in a deep sense. And I will use India's example to understand both. Historically, Indian society followed the four stages of life called Brahmacharya, Grihastha, Vanaprastha, and Sannyas. So the first half of the life was spent living integrated in a society, and the second half was spent detaching from the society. However, the dawn of Buddhism and Advaita in India progressively undermined the engagement part of the first half and progressively emphasized the detachment part of the second half. Thereby, becoming a monk or renunciate was treated as a path of enlightenment and liberation, while staying married in a family or working in a society was considered bondage and entanglement. But this was not the only problem. The additional problem was that Buddhism and Advaita stated that the deities in the temple, the rituals performed by the Brahmanas, and the acquisition of worldly knowledge was an illusion. The truth was only the self, and those who abandoned the illusion of family, duty, rituals, temples, deities, and worldly education were the superior transcendentalists, while those who continued with the illusion of family, duty, temples, deities, and worldly education were the inferior materialists. Thus, Buddhism and Advaita philosophically undermined social duties. In fact, liberation became an individual pursuit and the collective activities became bondage. Instead of renouncing a desire for results, people believed that renouncing duties was essential. This is what we would call throwing the baby along with the bathwater. The moment people start seeing duties as worldly attachment and bondage, they begin withdrawing from their duties. Now they act not for the collective good, but for the individual good, although that individualism is not material prosperity, but renunciation and detachment. Meanwhile, highly divided societies of the West were united by the idea of collective salvation, attained for those who die in a war and after the globalization of their religion. And so, this individual versus collective argument is wrong on two counts. One, Europeans may look individualist on the surface, but their religion is collectivist. Two, Indians may look collectivist on the surface, but they accepted religious individualism. Indians are the most individualistic society in the world today, because of diverse languages, cultures, and practices, which makes them think that everyone can choose whatever lifestyle they want to live, which is far greater individualism than someone living in a Western society where people are forced or expected to follow a standard language, culture, and practice to assimilate in a society. The question is, how do you create unity in diversity? The answer is that Krishna is the unity in diversity. Krishna is the soul and the world is his body. If the soul leaves the body, then the body disintegrates. Similarly, if a philosophy rejects forms of the supreme and each person considers himself supreme, then the world soul is gone and the world body will now disintegrate. In the same way, Buddhism and Advaita killed the world soul and gradually the world body disintegrated. Now, instead of doing their respective duties as delivering the collective good, each person began thinking of their individual good. When the unifying deities and duties are gone, then we are simply left with diversity without a unity. That is when a society is primed to be overtaken by any other society that knows how to unite people through promises of collective salvation after globalization of their religion. And so the overtaking of collectivist societies isn't because of collectivism, but due to individualism. And the societies that overtook were also collectivist from a religious standpoint, although on the surface they might appear individualistic. And so, this argument that individualistic societies prosper while collectivist societies collapse is fundamentally false. The truth is that all collectivist societies strengthen by performing duties, and all individualistic societies disintegrate by selfishness. Therefore, Krishna talks about renouncing the results of actions, but not the actions. If we discard the actions, then we get hyper individualism. But if we discard the results without discarding the actions, we get hyper collectivism. And so Krishna talks about distinguishing between working in devotion and working for fruitive results. Acting for fruitive results is individualistic, but working in devotion is collectivist. Then he says that even if people do their duties expecting fruitive results, the wise should not disturb them, such as by calling their work leading to bondage and entanglement. Rather, they should be engaged in duties, but the motive of those duties should be gradually changed from thinking about individual good to thinking about the greatest good. The impersonalists say that we must renounce activity to attain liberation. And Krishna says that we must change our motivation for doing the same work. Again, we can see how the Bhagavad-Gita is fundamentally different from the teaching of the impersonalists, and yet it has been presented as a valid interpretation of Bhagavad-Gita. In fact, all the problems of modern India arise from saying that we must discard our duties rather than change the motivation for duties from individual gain or loss to collective gain or loss. When these duties were rejected as material bondage due to perverted ideologies, then society fragmented and was overtaken by other societies that were united by the ideas of collective salvation and globalization of their religious ideology through conquest. And so the cause of decline of collectivist societies was not collectivism but individualism. And the cause of the rise of individualistic societies was also not individualism but collectivism. That cause is deep rooted in the religious ideologies of individual liberation in Indian religions versus the collective salvation of monotheisms. Finally, Krishna summarizes all these diverse conclusions in one verse by saying the following: Vai sarvani karmani sannyas adhyatma chetasa nirasir nirmamo bhutva yuddhasya vigatachara. Note the seemingly contradictory words such as sarvani karmani, which means doing all the actions, and then sannyas adhyatma chetasa, which means with a renounced and self-absorbed mindset. These two are not contradictory for Krishna, but the contradiction was created by later ideologies when they claimed that doing all the worldly actions is bondage, while the renouncing and self-absorbed mindset is liberation. The conflict between karma and sannyas doesn't exist in Krishna's words because he advises both in the same verse. The engagement pertains to actions and the renunciation pertains to results. There is no prescription for renouncing the actions in order to renounce the results, as later misconceptions claimed. And so Krishna says, Nirasir nirmamo bhutva yuddhasya vigatachara, which means without desires and without attachments, fight devoid of this fever and lethargy that has overtaken you. Thus, Krishna dissolves the seeming conflict between bondage by engagement and liberation by detachment. And the dissolution of conflict comes from the word Mai, which means me. Krishna asks Arjuna to do everything for him. And so this chapter began by Arjuna asking about whether Jnana Yoga or Karma Yoga is superior. Initially, Krishna dissolved the difference between the two. And now Krishna converted Karma Yoga into Bhakti Yoga. To a naive reader, this may sound like too much confusion. But there is no confusion if Jnana Yoga means the theoretical understanding of the greatest truth, virtue, and bliss, and Karma Yoga means acting in accordance with the understanding of the greatest truth, virtue, and bliss. Meanwhile, Bhakti Yoga is devotion to Krishna, who is himself the greatest truth, virtue, and bliss. Now, Jnana Yoga is theoretical understanding, Karma Yoga is practical implementation, and Bhakti Yoga is emotional attraction. The same thing becomes theoretical, practical, and emotional. That is because the self is Satchidanand. The Sat is the practical aspect, the Chit is the theoretical aspect, and the Anand is the emotional aspect. They are three, and yet they are one. Thus, we can distinguish between two mutually opposed ideas about sannyas. The first idea is renouncing the world and worldly duties. The second idea is doing the duties while renouncing the desire for results. The world and the worldly duties were renounced in the Varnashram system in the last stage of life called sannyas. And when Arjuna argued against the Mahabharat war, he essentially wanted to take sannyas and live like a hermit even during his youth. But Krishna dissuaded Arjuna from that path of renouncing the duties and advocates the renunciation of the results. And thus, through Karma Yoga, we get the second idea of sannyas, which is living in the world and performing one's duties without thinking about personal gain and loss. This is the Sattva Guna stage of action. Then Krishna goes beyond that into transcendence to say that Arjuna should do everything for his pleasure. Instead of attachment to the material results, Arjuna should become attached to Krishna. And so there are three stages of life, namely attachment to work and results, doing the duty without expecting results, and then working for Krishna. Then in two verses, Krishna talks about without envy and with envy. The words are Suya and Anasuya, which means envious and non-envious. Formerly, sannyas as the last stage of life was meant for collective good, under which a sannyasi would travel the world to teach people about devotion to the Supreme Lord. engaging them in their duties, but changing the motivation for doing those duties. But in the impersonalist conception of sannyas, there is no supreme lord, and one is himself the supreme. And so Krishna describes this envious conception of self as the supreme as sarvagyan vimudans tan viddhi nastan achetasa, which means bereft of all knowledge, befooled, and ruined in their endeavors for perfection. Conversely, Krishna also says that all those who execute their duties according to my injunctions without envy become free from the bondage of birth and death. And so these impersonalistic ideas of liberation by self absorption after renouncing one's duties are again rejected as the mindset of a fool who doesn't attain liberation but instead ruins himself in the process of trying to attain perfection. This is historically proven through the destruction of all societies that took to godless religions, in which the ultimate goal of life is self realization devoid of God realization, because the self is equated to God. After explaining the nature of the envious and non envious people, Krishna explains why the envious person who falsely takes to renunciation fails. He says, even a man of knowledge acts according to his own nature, for everyone follows the nature he has acquired from the three modes. The fundamental problem is that both the soul and the body have their qualitative natures, and it is often very hard to judge whether someone is acting based on their spiritual or material nature. An easy example is religions that engage in violence for material greed but justify it as their pathway to heaven. In some religions, resource grabbing is called a holy war, and so their actions look the same as someone fighting for the protection of truth and virtue. But the deeper reality is that the person is not interested in truth and virtue, but in grabbing someone else's land. Similarly, many people collect disciples and followers and call that service of the greater spiritual good. But they don't actually condemn lies and immorality. They don't separate themselves from those who indulge in cheating and vices because they find all these personally inconvenient. And so these people are acting based on a material nature acquired in past lives. And yet, they may claim that they are engaged in spiritual activities. That is because both spirit and matter have their natures, and both are mixed up in our mental and sensual activities. And while acting according to material nature, a person may justify it as an activity based on spiritual nature. And so we can ask, how do we know what is material nature versus spiritual nature? How do we separate the two? And the answer is that one must engage in selfless duties and not do what is contrary to duty and consistently perform his duties. When we steadfastly stick to duty, then we find that our material nature hinders the performance of duty while our spiritual nature supports it. For example, those who call land grab a holy war stop fighting if by the war they lose land. But a person who fights for the protection of truth and virtue doesn't stop even if he endures material losses. Likewise, those who call land grab a holy war start new wars if there is a possibility of getting more land. But a person who fights for the protection of truth and virtue doesn't fight unless truth and virtue are at risk. Likewise, a person genuinely interested in spiritual progress condemns lies and immorality and separates himself from those engaged in cheating and vices, even if it is personally inconvenient to him. Meanwhile, a person interested in worldly adulation and worship compromises the truth and virtue and neglects his duty as a guru or teacher. And so it is very easy to distinguish between material and spiritual natures if we stick to duty. Duty is that lemon juice which splits the milk and separates water from the milk solids called paneer. Conversely, those who renounce duty keep mixing the material and spiritual and keep justifying their material motivations as spiritual motivations. But duty carries us away from material to spiritual. In the first chapter, Arjuna justified his non-violence as compassion, morality, and love. And yet, Krishna has been telling him about fighting as the duty. And so, Arjun's ideas are based on his material nature, and Krishna's teaching is based on spiritual nature. And so, knowing the duty is the first step, and then steadfastly sticking to that duty while carefully rejecting all that is contrary to duty automatically reveals the difference between spiritual and material nature. As one follows this path of duty, all the material natures are cleansed and the spiritual nature is revealed. However, if someone concocts their duty based on some false ideas of the nature of spirit, then he acts according to the material nature, and yet he thinks that he is acting for his spiritual benefit. Such a person is always lost because the false idea of spirit is matter. For example, in India, many impersonalists advance the falsehood of oneness of all individuals and religions and created socialism and secularism, in which the qualified people and virtuous religions were degraded and the unqualified people and unvirtuous religions were elevated. Their sentimental ideas of equality, love, and brotherhood were exactly like the sentimental ideas of Arjun trying to avoid war, and the result was emboldening criminals to even greater crimes, corruption, and violence. The impersonalists believed that if thesis tolerates the antithesis, then it will become synthesis. But what actually happens is that if the thesis tolerates the antithesis, then the antithesis destroys the thesis, and then we are only left with the antithesis. Thus, John Stuart Mill once said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." This is how, when people have false ideas of spiritual nature, they act according to their material nature, contrary to spiritual nature. And the result is always the opposite of what they had imagined. Therefore, spiritual nature is not simply opinion or interpretation. We can apply those opinions and interpretations in this world and empirically prove that false ideas produce results opposite to what they had originally claimed to achieve. Prabhupada used to often employ the phrase phalena parichyate, which means by the results you can know whether something is correct or incorrect. Of course, these results take time and people tend to forget history. But if they remember history, then they can know that the incorrect ideas produce the opposite of the envisioned results. By now, Arjun has realized that his sentimental ideas of love and brotherhood are actually contrary to dharma and therefore sinful activities. And so he asks, "O descendant of Vrishni, by what is one impelled to sinful acts, even unwillingly, as if engaged by force?" This question is a signal that Arjuna has realized that he has been moving unwillingly towards adharma as if by force. The inner symptom of that forceful movement in Arjun is that even though he was talking about love and brotherhood, he wasn't truly convinced. In fact, he was feeling unhappy and depressed. As we discussed earlier, there are two contradictory forces within us. First, there is a moral voice of Paramatma who guides us on the righteous path. Second, there is Pashupati pulling us based on our previously acquired nature. And so, if our previously acquired nature is pure, then Paramatma and Pashupati pull us in the same direction. But if the previously acquired nature is impure, then Paramatma and Pashupati pull us in different directions, which may sometimes even be opposed. Now we get a strong inner conflict if these two are more or less equal, which is why in the initial stages of spiritual practice, there is a strong tendency to fall from the spiritual path. Because Paramatma guides us on the righteous path, while due to our acquired immoral nature, Pashupati pulls us in the opposite direction. However, if we listen to the Paramatma, then our acquired nature gradually changes and then the inner conflict reduces. Eventually, we come to the stage where Paramatma and Pashupati pull in the same direction, and then the inner conflict dies and the person becomes completely peaceful. But this process can take time, so one has to be patient. Of course, if one kills the voice of Paramatma and acquires a strong recalcitrant nature, again that person feels no guilt, shame, or inner conflict because only Pashupati pulls him in a direction acquired by previous nature. And so, criminals and psychopaths also don't feel any guilt, shame, or inner conflict because they silence the Paramatma and then Pashupati pulls them in the acquired nature direction. And so, within everyone, there are two kinds of forces, one material and the other spiritual. The spiritual voice is the voice of Paramatma, and the material voice is the voice of our previously acquired nature being manifest from the unmanifest state by Pashupati. Our consciousness is not a clean slate because there is a previously acquired nature which may be unclean. And yet, everyone has the guiding force of Paramatma in the heart. Both Pashupati and Paramatma are divine, and yet they act in opposite ways if our acquired nature is opposite to the spiritual nature. And due to these opposite ways, sometimes a person goes on the spiritual path and sometimes on the material path. Whichever path he prioritizes more slowly becomes the default path. In this regard, there is a famous Native American saying which goes as follows: inside of me there are two dogs. One is mean and evil, and the other is good, and they fight each other all the time. When asked which one wins, I answer, the one I feed the most. So, this feeding of the dog is our choice, which means we are not devoid of free will, even if there are two voices inside us. If we study the Shaiva and Shakta Tantra philosophy, we will find a detailed description of how the soul is covered by material nature in three main stages. I call these stages inferiority, superiority, and mediocrity to make it easy to understand for those who might not be familiar with this philosophy. The first stage of covering is inferiority, and it is called Maya, which means that which is not. Maya makes us feel inadequate, insufficient, incompetent, and incomplete. Factually, the soul is a partial truth, virtue, and bliss, so it is incomplete by itself. But in the association of the Supreme Person, who is complete truth, virtue, and bliss, the soul feels complete. But when the soul leaves the association of the Supreme Person, then this feeling of incompleteness covers it, and that is called Maya. Now the soul feels far more inadequate, insufficient, incompetent, and incomplete than its factual state of being the partial truth, virtue, and bliss. And so Maya is often described as the cause of all suffering in the world. We can see this with the wealthiest and most powerful people. They have so much and yet they feel incomplete. And they go about chasing more wealth and power, and no matter how much wealth and power they acquire, they still feel incomplete. In fact, when one feels incomplete after many endeavors, then he becomes even more hopeless. From this feeling of inferiority arises an anger at one's perceived humiliation. A person asserts, I am not inadequate, insufficient, incompetent, and incomplete. Rather, I am the boss, master, enjoyer, and controller. And even if right now I feel incomplete, I will become complete by my efforts. And so, as a side effect of Maya, a person tries to become complete, which only the Supreme Person is. So, it is said that the soul tries to replace or compete with God. This is the lust. But when lust mixes with the previous feeling of inferiority, it transforms into an inner rage and anger, which basically says, I am great, and yet right now I haven't proven my greatness, so I feel incomplete. But I will overcome this incompleteness by proving that I am complete. And so, from the deep inner inferiority arises lust and anger, which are marks of one's imagined superiority. The lust is to become the supreme, and the rage is that one hasn't yet become the supreme. This sense of superiority is called pradhana in Sankhya philosophy, which means the boss, master, enjoyer, and controller. Of course, before one can become the supreme, one has to become a master, boss, controller, and enjoyer of something that is not supreme and yet sufficiently important in the soul's imagination. That limited sense of supremacy is called prakriti, or one's inner nature. From this limited inner nature arise one's goals, morals, and beliefs, which are sometimes distinguished as ego, morality, and intellect, and sometimes collectively called the intellect. From there arises mind and senses, and from there emerges a body. The body constrains us into a limited time, place, and situation. And yet, a person tries to establish his supremacy in these limited times, places, and situations. The result is mediocrity, because even if one establishes his supremacy in some limited time, place, and situation, it is still infinitely small compared to the cosmic reality. And so, if a person thinks about his dominance over a limited time, place, and situation, he feels delighted and fulfilled and begins to relax, thinking that he is now the master, controller, enjoyer, and boss. But if the same person thinks about the cosmic reality, which he hasn't yet conquered and dominated, then he again feels inferior, incomplete, inadequate, and insufficient. These two conditions are sometimes called avranatmika and prakshepatmika. Under avranatmika, or the satisfied state, a soul feels he has achieved enough and starts relaxing. But under prakshepatmika, the same soul feels he has not proven his supremacy yet, because there is still the rest of the cosmos to conquer and subjugate, and he again becomes totally dissatisfied. So, this duality of feeling satisfied with one's condition in one sense and then feeling dissatisfied with the same condition in another sense keeps pushing the person through the cycle of birth and death until he realizes the original problem of Maya and how his happiness lies only in living in the service and shelter of the Supreme Person, not in trying to become the boss, master, controller, or enjoyer. Now, if we understand this big picture, then we can understand why Krishna talks about lust of Pradhan and Prakriti, and then anger and wrath at having failed to prove one's supremacy. Generally speaking, the lust is deep within and the anger is projected outward, which means we blame others for our problems because we already assumed that we are the greatest boss, master, controller, and enjoyer. So, if our lust is not fulfilled, then someone else must be responsible for our failure. Thus, we get the duality of love and hate: love for those who fulfill our lust, and hate for those who hinder the fulfillment of our lust. Then, if our lust is fulfilled a little bit, We get pride and think I am the master, boss, controller, and enjoyer. But the very next moment, we develop greed for more and more because we find that our mastery is so limited. Then, if we see that others have more than us, we become envious. Finally, if we don't find a path to become the supreme, we feel lost and confused. In this way, lust, anger, greed, pride, envy, and confusion are the essential traits of the material condition. We can call it the duality of love and hate, or the duality of feeling relaxed and agitated. The root cause is forgetting the Supreme Lord, then feeling inferiority, then developing the lust of trying to prove our superiority, and then suffering in mediocrity. This triad of inferiority, superiority, and mediocrity exists in our intellect, mind, senses, and body, and it cycles all the time. Due to that cycling of inferiority, superiority, and mediocrity, sometimes we think we can not do anything. Then we think we can do anything we want. And then we try a lot and fail, and then think we can only do so much and no more. And then again, we feel we cannot do anything. And so the soul keeps cycling in this cycle of feeling hopeless, then feeling confident, then feeling resigned, and again feeling hopeless, confident, and resigned. So now the question arises how to regulate this cycle of emotions arising within us. And Krishna answers engage in your duties. If we keep our mind busy in the service of the Lord, then we don't experience this cycle of hopeless, confident, and resigned, the duality of love and hate, or the duality of relaxed and agitated. But if we come out of the Lord's service, again we are gripped by this cycle of hopeless, confident, and resigned, the duality of love and hate, the duality of relaxed and agitated. And so eternal life means always remain engaged in the Lord's service and the performance of duty. Now, as we have discussed, the Atma has three aspects called moral, rational, and emotional. The emotions of lust, anger, greed, pride, envy, and confusion are the perversions of spiritual emotions, and they drag us into immoral life of duty neglect. But morality and emotionality are only two aspects of the self. So if emotions are perverted and lead us to immorality, then we can go back to the rational side of the Atma, which is reasoning, philosophy, and analysis. And thus Krishna acknowledges that the pull of a previously acquired nature is very strong, and that nature creates new desires in us, and thus forces us to act in sinful ways. And yet, we also have intelligence by which we can control our emotions and then engage ourselves into duties. To support his argument, Krishna says that the intellect is superior to the mind, which is superior to the senses, which is superior to the body. As a result, the intellect can control the mind, and then the mind can control the senses, and then the senses can control the body. However, to do that, the soul has to rely on the intellect, which means don't succumb to the emotions in the mind and the desires in the senses, but bring the mind and the senses under the control of the intellect. And so, philosophy, rationality, and analysis take the greatest importance for someone struggling with emotions and desires. But if one controls these emotions through intellect and keeps their emotions focused on the Supreme Lord, then intellect becomes less important. And so there are three main driving forces in life, namely emotionality, rationality, and morality. In an ultimate sense, everyone wants to be blissful, so emotionality is most important. But we are not going to get to that blissful state by immorality. So if we succumb to lust, anger, greed, pride, envy, and confusion, then immorality is guaranteed. Therefore, emotions become the least important for a spiritual practitioner, and rationality becomes the most important. That rationality, as we discussed at the beginning of this video, is not simply theory without practice. Rather, the theory is used to ensure consistent practice. And so, spiritual life begins with rationality or theory, then goes into morality or practice, and finally it culminates in blissful emotionality. When the theory is known perfectly, then the focus shifts to practice. And when the practice is perfected, then the focus shifts to enjoyment. And so all these apparent conflicts between emotionality, rationality, and morality, which people sometimes called bhakti, jnana, and karma, are simply man-made myths. All three are necessary, and all of them collectively are sufficient. And yet, for each person in a different stage of spiritual perfection, each one becomes more or less important. We are not going to go very far in spiritual life by rejecting one of the soul's eternal aspects. And yet, those who haven't understood that the soul is eternally emotionality, rationality, and morality, or the triad of bhakti, jnana, and karma, create the myth that only one of them is enough. So many people read Bhagavad-Gita and call themselves a follower of Bhagavad-Gita, but they just focus on either bhakti, jnana, or karma and think that they are perfectly following Bhagavad-Gita. They don't realize that without knowledge, our emotions take us into immorality. Without morality, we can justify an illusion as truth. And without bliss, we can't sustain morality or knowledge. So all three are necessary and collectively they are sufficient because they are simply three aspects of each person. And we have to take the whole of Bhagavad Gita seriously to understand how Krishna integrates them. In this chapter alone, we saw how Krishna initially integrated Jnana Yoga and Karma Yoga, and then he integrated Bhakti Yoga with Karma Yoga, and then in the end, he again integrated Karma Yoga with Jnana Yoga. In this way, Krishna completed the loop of going from Buddhi Yoga in the last chapter to Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, and again Buddhi Yoga. So these fragmented and divisive ideologies are simply man-made myths. Those who read Bhagavad Gita seriously can see how Krishna integrates all of them into one whole.